And it's actually not, it's actually like a virtual machine like Java. So this is interpreted by the renderer on the fly. And it gets efficient because of the fact that it doesn't run on just one point at once. It runs at many points at a time. And this is something, I'm not sure if you guys have heard the term, it's called SIMD, or single instruction, multiple data. And it allows you basically to take a whole bunch of data, like a whole bunch of micropolygons, and shade them all at once. And that is what your CPU is designed to do most efficiently. That's also what GPUs do to get their speed. So an example of that, I know many of you are probably not programmers, but the way it works is on the left is you also make a for loop, where you loop over a bunch of data. For each D in data, I'm going to do a bunch of things. Rather than do that in SIMD, we have 3 steps here. For each D in data, do A, then do B, then do C. You could also do it as for each D in data, do A, then for each D in data, do B, for each D in data, do C. Having lots of little small loops that operate on large amounts of data is actually more efficient. And that is how RACE is designed to work. You also know about your neighbors in this. Because it's done on a grid of points, you can also say, all right, well, what is my normal for my neighbor, as well as what is my current normal? And that's actually what allows the renderer to do things like move points around the displacement and not get and not get cracks or things like that. So you have smooth, you can actually tell your neighbor's value, which allows you to do texture filtering, to measure things like curvature, and do displacement. Now here's some detail I'm going to skip over a little bit. Sorry, I realize this is a little too detailed. So that's rays. Let's go over to ray tracing so you guys can see the comparison from another renderer like V-Ray or Mental Ray. Those work through a different technique. Rather than dividing the scene into buckets, you actually shoot and then dice the micropolygons. The whole scene is tessellated up front. So there's none of this micropolygon. You have to have all your scene in memory, and then you shoot rays out of the camera, and you run these intersection tests against the objects in the scene. The cool thing about this is, because the whole scene is there, you can do things like figure out if you're in shadow or not, do reflections within a single pass, which is something a race render can't do. So now you're probably thinking, like, all right, if you can't have shadows in race, why would you ever want to render that way? And I alluded to it earlier, but that's what gives us, we always can do multiple passes. For instance, this is a shadow map. How many of you have heard of shadow maps before? No one's even heard of a shadow map. Well, this is how shadows are done in games. Suffice to say, in games, nobody is ray tracing yet. That is not a technique that's being available. So it's worth knowing what this is, even if you're not going to use a ray to render. Shadow map, in a game and with rays, you only are dicing points. You don't know where the other points are, because once you're done rendering a bucket, you've forgotten the rest. A shadow map is a pre-pass. You render the scene from the perspective of a camera. Sorry, you render the scene from the perspective of the light. So essentially, you look out the light, and you see the scene, but you only keep track of the depth. You store that in a texture map. Then, in the final pass, often called the beauty pass, we read that texture map and see, is this point closer or further than the depth in the shadow map? It's called the depth test. So this allows you to see if you're in shadow or not, but it requires 2 passes as opposed to 1. Turns out, this is actually a lot faster, hence the fact that this is used in games. There are things you give up by doing this. You have to have a finite resolution. You can't have a shadow with a blur as distant depth dependent, but it's really fast. However, ray tracing, you can shoot rays to measure whether or not you're in shadow or not, and we call that a transmission ray. Camera ray is a ray that tells you, where the point is in the camera. That's like the first ray you're shooting. But then we might have other rays for doing things like reflection and color light. And Yeah, at certain rays we need to do more work than others. If you're doing a shadow ray, you typically don't need to know the color of the object that is blocking the light source. You just need to know, are you blocked? Whereas if it's something like a reflection, like looking in the mirror, you'll need to know the color as well. So there's a different amount of work that needs to be done depending on the ray type. All right, and where we're going in this is that the latest state-of-the-art techniques do use ray tracing all over the place to get these effects. And how to keep render times down is one of the major challenges we have. So that's sort of the motivation of how rendering actually works. What is ray tracing? What is rays? Because we're going to use that vocabulary for a while. But now comes the history lesson. Between Toy Story and Incredibles, believe it or not, we did not trace a single ray. All right, maybe we traced this a couple, but 99% of all the rendering done on these Pixar films were all done using this technique that is very fast. And there are many things we need to do to get the fancy effects we have, because hopefully you'll admit that Nemo and Incredibles look pretty good, but we did it with what is considered much simpler technology. And also this is the stuff that still is needed for games. So like I said, for shadows, it's all about shadow maps. On the right is a depth image rendered from the perspective of a light source, where white is close, black is far away. And the left is the beauty pass that checks to see if points of the scene are closer or further from those depth images. And here's an example of that being done all the way back in 1988 on Tin Toy. Who here has seen Tin Toy? Anyone seen? No one saw Tin Toy? Oh, it's on YouTube. But anyway, in 1988, this was considered cutting edge, and it had shadows that were being done through shadow maps. Now, Toy Story, hopefully more of you have seen. You can see how we both have shadows. Also, look at the table there. You can see some reflection in the table. You might think, hey, you just said reflection needed ray tracing. Not true. There's what's called reflection maps, or just like a shadow map, you can render the scene in a pre-pass. This is probably from the perspective of the table up. And then you can check, hey, am I in the position seen by that previous pass? A common thing is to have an environment map. You just see, which direction am I facing? That's the latitude and longitude in your spherical environment map. And you can get what looks like reflection. A lot of effects you can't get with this, but in Toy Story, perfectly fine. And again, it's done through multiple passes, because rays does not support querying the rest of the scene. I showed this slide earlier, talking about deep shadow maps. This is showing how shadow maps earlier just had a single depth value, which is fine for time. But if you have hair, and fur, or vegetation, or volumes, you can't just have a single depth value. You need to have how much material there was seen from that direction of the camera. So you can think of it almost like it's a 2.5 deep texture. It's a volumetric shadow. And you can see there with that smoke up there, with a regular depth map, you just have a single value, and where it's very thin, you get nothing. Whereas here, you actually have many values per pixel. You can use that for hair self-shadow and volume self-shadow. So that's one way. In Monsters University, we got Monsters Incorporated, wrong one, we had very good looking effects. Talking about displacement again, that's a way we had a lot of complexity. Just like you saw earlier with that car, that was a cube that we displaced into a single object. This is being done even earlier on Finding Nemo for the coral. There was a lot of coral in those reef shots. We didn't model every barnacle on every coral. Rather, as you see there, we had a bunch of ellipses overlapping each other, and the shader displaced it into that pattern we see on the right. Even something like translucency, which you might think requires ray tracing, we did that with a number of tricks back in the day. One of them is to take the angle between the normal and the camera. That's that N.I angle right there. That gives you the effect of sort of brightness on the edge, darkness in the center, kind of like an X-ray shader. You guys have ever used it? We use that signal as well as the normal before displacement. Angle between that and the view vector. It was like a soft X-ray. It was like a soft X-ray and a fine X-ray together, tinted a color, It looks like that's actually translucent. There's a fun little shading trick we did for translucency on Finding Nemo. Another thing we did is this fish right there, Bubbles, part of the tank gang. He was a see-through fish. You could actually see his guts underneath the skin. We did that rather than saying ray tracing a ton of rays through his body. We had a texture map that we just blurred. And then that modulated the color. So blurred texture map did the trick. And with those techniques, we get entire coral reefs. However, as technology got better, even before we started doing ray tracing, we wanted to make these techniques look better. Better because those translucency tricks I showed you guys were not very accurate. Another thing we ended up doing in the Incredibles era is doing what's called point-based subsurface scattering, which is in the same theme as what I told you guys earlier, is in race renderers. To keep things cheap, you render many passes, each should do a different effect. In the subsurface scattering, for subsurface scattering, what we do is we write out, for this teapot here, all of the diffuse lighting. So basically, all the lighting you see. We call that a radiosity point cloud. And then, once it's in this point cloud format, we can blur it. We basically average each point with the point of its neighbors, then tint it by a color, often called albedo. Then we read that into the beauty pass in addition to the diffuse. And check it out, that teapot looks like it's translucent. Kind of almost looks like it's made of flesh, which is kind of weird. But that was the technique we used on Incredibles back in 2004 to get the skin shading. That was what we call point-based subsurface scattering. And there's an equivalent in games that is called image-based subsurface scattering that can do an approximation of this. So that's how, through the years, from 1995 to 2004, we did our rendering. However, as machines got faster, we wanted better, more, faster, So in Cars 2 Brave, that is when Pixar started doing ray tracing. And what I'm going to show you guys now are the techniques we added now that we had this ability. So RenderMan, even though principally it does ray tracing, rays, we added the ability to do ray tracing as well, but as a hybrid